Oh, that's great. We have our slideshow in order. So you're all very welcome, folks here today. Welcome to our Leaving Certs from around the country. We've 4 poems to look at. It's quite ambitious. Some of them are linked, some of them are a little bit independent, but they are all poetry and they're all poems. So that holds them together. Just have a quick look at our slides. We've John Donne. This is an era before photographs. So we're lucky to have a few paintings of John Donne. That's him there on your left with the rakish looking hat on him, which kind of suits the poem which he wrote as a young man, about 23 or 4. That we're going to read from him. Luckily, we've modern photography, gives us Caroline Duffy there from Glasgow originally. That's her on your right. And looking very pensive and serious there, as a poet might. And then below we have Percy Beach Shelley, romantic poet, died young, 32 years of age. And we have a painting of him, lucky enough as well. And beside him from Ireland, we have Paula Meehan, who's no stranger to the college here, having presented our literary awards just before COVID came along. So there are our poets. I've taken a quote from the poem we'll finish on, Paula Meehan's poem, and we'll talk about poetry as transformation. Now, I'll talk about that once we've read our first poem, and I'll mention how each poem might be a transformative act for the reader. And these are our 4 poems, just to give you an introduction, or to everybody here in the room. That's our flea. I did manage to get a lovely image of a flea online. If you ever want to know what a flea looks like, that's it, with possibly blood inside it, I don't know, which will be relevant to our poem. It's John Donne's very famous, infamous poem, The Flea. Then we have Carol Ann Duffy's Valentine, which features an onion as a central metaphor, and that's a beautiful onion that we have there for our image. Then Percy B. Shelley's Ozymandias, set in Egypt and the Egyptian deserts with a ruined monument. I don't think that type of monument really exists. That's sort of a mock-up of what Shelley's describing in the poem. And then finally, Paula Meehan's wonderful poem deals with her father in a fingless garden, and I got an image of the movie The Father, and Anthony Hopkins looking elderly there with his daughter for our image for that one. So there are 4 poems we're going to look at today. They're both on the ordinary and higher Leaving Cert syllabus. And we'll begin with John Donne's poem, The Flea, and I've some headline terms there that we'll consider. We're going to read it in a moment, and I'll say 1 or 2 things first just before we read it. And normally in class I get a couple of you to read it and hear the poem a few times. I recommend that the poetry is best heard and let it enter the ear, as we'll see as we're going along. There are 3 elements in a dramatic situation here in this poem. We have the speaker of the poem, who may be a version of John Donne and may not be. It's a sort of invented persona. And the setup of the poem, this is part of an old tradition in poetry, and is the poetry of seduction. People often turn to poetry where love and romance and other things of that nature are involved, and poetry is particularly adept at expressing people's interests and desires in this area. And this poem is part of a long tradition of the poetry of seduction. So the speaker of the poem is the person speaking the poem, but we know from what he's saying that there's a lady listening to him, and she's carrying out certain actions that he responds to directly. And from his response, we can guess what she has done or said to him, although she doesn't speak necessarily in the poem. And the third protagonist, or a player in the poem, is the flea itself, which becomes part of the metaphor that Donne wants to develop in the poem. And I will argue that this poem is an extended metaphor, that he sets up a connection between the flea and the 2 people, the man and the woman, in the first stanza of the poem, and he develops that then across the poem itself. So it becomes an extended metaphor. Donne is particularly adept at this form, and it becomes very influential in the tradition. And I would argue that To Valentine by Caroline Duffy, 5 centuries later, is actually a version of this type of poem continued from Donne. So that's roughly the setup. So we'll listen to that then. We've the man, he's really trying to seduce the lady, and he's using the flea as part of his argument against her, okay, or to her, to comply to his wishes, and so on. So here's the poem, The Flea. We'll have a listen to it first. Again, recommend reading this quite a few times if you can. But The Flea by John Donne. Mark but this flea, and mark in this how little that which thou deniest me is. It sucked me first, and now sucks thee, and in this flea our 2 bloods mingled be. Thou knowest this cannot be said, a sin or shame or loss of maidenhead. Yet this enjoys before it woo, and pampered swells with 1 blood made of 2, and this, alas, is more than we would do. Oh, stay, 3 lives in 1 flea spare, where we almost, nay, more than married are. This flea is you and I, and this our marriage bed and marriage temple is. Though parents grudge and you, we're met and cloistered in these living walls of jet. Though use make you apt to kill me, let not to that self-murder add it be, and sacrilege, 3 sins in killing 3. Cruel and sudden hast thou since purpled thy nail in blood of innocence. Wherein could this flea guilty be, except in that drop which it sucked from thee? Yet thou triumphst, and sayest that thou findest not thyself nor me the weaker now. 'Tis true, then learn how false fears be. Just so much honour when thou yieldest to me will waste, as this flea's death took life from thee. So there we go, very elaborate poem of seduction, as it were. So we'll talk through the poem quickly and then I'll say a few ideas about it. First, just thing to note, it was written in 1595, but wasn't published until after Donne's death in 1633, possibly for the reason of its radical nature, actually. We reckon he circulated his poetry in private manuscripts amongst his friends, and it might have been too radical for public consumption in his lifetime, but it became very famous thereafter. So he opens with notice, mark, as in mark someone's card, take notice of me, and so on. He's saying that notice this little flea which has taken a bite. So the setup of the poem is the flea has taken a bite out of John Donne, has taken a bite out of his lady he wishes to seduce, or the speaker of the poem, I should say, rather than John Donne. And somehow the two of them have joined together in the body of this flea, and they've been united beyond the norm, so to speak. And you might take it then what that might suggest, and that's essentially what the poet wants to build on. And really the fly took the blood from you, took the blood from me, joined the two together, and you know what, you're not feeling too bad after all that. It hasn't done you any harm. How little that which thou deniest me is. It was so easily taken away. It sucked me first, and now it sucks you, and in this flea our 2 bloods mingle be. So that's the setup, and he's setting up the metaphor there, the very unusual comparison that he makes, right? It's the first thing we'll say. So a metaphor will always involve a comparison. Now he'll develop this comparison as the poem goes on. But he's really saying our unity has been achieved already in the flea, hasn't done any harm to us. Let's go a step further. There are more interesting ways that we might be joined together, is suggested there, right? So in this blood, our flea, our 2 bloods mingled be. And this hasn't done you any harm. It's not a sin. You've encountered no shame, and you haven't lost your virginity, essentially, through this means, a loss of maidenhead, an old-fashioned way of putting that. But the flea did this before it wooed you or me, it leapt in and did all that, and it hasn't done you any harm. And pampered, it swells with this 1 blood made of the 2 of us coming together. The swelling is a suggestive element there. I'm going to say no more than that. For those who are vividly minded, can have a thought or a laugh over that one. And unfortunately, isn't it terrible? The flea has done more than we would do. How terrible. The flea has got there before me, and I'm sure I'd be far more interested in suckling your blood, so to speak, than the flea would be. Imagine what fun that might be. So that's the basic setup and the premise of the poem is established that much. Now he's going to build on it as the poem then goes along. Now, we know from her responses that she's about to go and kill the flea, which would be a very sensible thing to do for hygiene reasons or otherwise, or even just to shut the man up and stop him in his game of seduction kind of thing. So he says, oh, stop, stop, he says, 3 lives and 1 flea spared. All 3 of us, the flea itself, me and you, were joined together in this flea. In fact, we're almost more than married. Right, we're more than married, because that's the issue at stake here. Where we almost may, in fact, no, we're more than married are. In fact, this flea is you and I. We're joined together, and now we see him really develop the metaphor. He's saying it is our marriage bed. We've come together in this flea. That's a striking comparison. So the flea itself is our marriage bed. We've come together in that flea there. And he steps the metaphor even further, because religion is at stake here. He said it's even become our temple. All right, so it's become a holy thing, and we're joined together in this. So that's the next stage of his argument, and he's tackling religion and holding back on this prenuptial moment, so to speak. Now, your parents might give out about me and you doing this kind of thing. They might be a force that would stop you, though parents grudge. And then you might want it to happen, but we're met, we're joined together. And we see him develop the religious language, cloister, the term taken from monasteries and convents. And there's an irony here because they are places of chastity. But Donne is saying we've almost religiously come together in the convent or the temple, the monastery, cloistered in these living walls of jet being jet black, and the black body of the flea, and they're living walls. Now she's going to try and kill the flea, though you're going to try and kill me in that. That's terrible. I mean, now you're worried about losing your chastity and you're going to commit murder. You're going to kill me. As the drama of the situation intensifies, you're going to kill me. And he said, and worse again, don't add to that the terrible crime as it was at the time, and religious crime as such, of self-murder, which is suicide. So you're not only going to kill me if you kill that flea because we're joined together in it, you're going to kill yourself because you're in there as well, he dramatically suggests. And then he goes further again, he says, and sacrilege, right? So it'll be a sin against holiness. You'll have committed a crime against God because we've come together in this holy temple of the flea there now. And so if you kill that fly, you'll kill three things all at once. So that would be really terrible. You've committed a crime of murder. So Gerd's going, gee, that's very elaborate altogether. Am I following this guy? Samuel Johnson, the great critic of Donne, described him as perplexing the minds of the fairer sex, famously. Gerd's trying to work out what exactly is he saying to me here, and so on. Now, from the third stanza, we gather that the lady in question has actually killed the fly, and she thinks, I've stopped him now, he'll shut up, kind of thing. But the speaker of this poem is very, very persuasive and witty and sharp, and he'll now try and turn this next stage of things to his advantage. So that's what he does in the third stanza. Cruel and sudden hast thou since purple thy nail in blood of innocence. Almost now the fly has become a martyr with purple, a religious colour, for dying in the cause, so to speak. And it was purely innocent blood, religious-like suggestion there. Sure, what could the flea be guilty of? Well, what has it done wrong that you've killed a flea? The speaker asked. Only that it took a drop of blood that it sucked from thee. Now you triumph and you say, well, now I'm not feeling any weaker for all that, so you're just talking claptrap. It hasn't harmed me to kill the flea at all, and I'm feeling perfectly fine, and you're not any way weaker because of that. And then he turns that around brilliantly in the last move in the poem, and he says, well, look, you don't feel any the worse for murdering that poor fly, and imagine you've murdered it and so on, and you don't feel too bad about it. Well, then if the two of us hop in the sack, you won't feel too bad about that either, because it's surely not worse than murder, what you've just done in killing the fly, and you don't feel bad about it. So that's his final play as the poem ends. Just so much honour when thou yields to me will waste, as this flea's death took life from thee. So its death took nothing away from you in the end, and losing your virginity to me will not take anything away from you in the end. So he has his final ploy there at the end, right? So the poem sets up a comparison. Let's stand back for now. We've talked about it generally, just quickly, and I'm sure Leaving Cert students are familiar with it at this stage. Let's look at some of what he has done. Well, A is a very consistent, irregular form, which my students would be used to. I think it's a 9-line stanza and has a rhyming scheme of A, A, B, B, C, C, D, 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 and you continue that across the poem, which in itself is an adroit achievement to have a speaker consistently speak and develop an argument across the poem, and within 3 stanzas and a set rhyming scheme, and yet not sound forced. So linguistically, that's a challenge and an achievement in itself, and Donne is going to be enjoying that. So metaphors set up a similarity and a difference, and the great thing about John Donne's comparison is we were never ever going to see a flea be part of a seductive poem until we've read this poem. So it's a most unusual vehicle to carry out his metaphorical line of thought, very unexpected, yet he brilliantly exploits it, because the flea sucks your blood, and if it crawls on 2 different people, we can imagine it would suck the blood from the both of them and join it together, and we have seen then how he turns that into a brilliant metaphor of the unity of the two of them in the bedroom or in the bed, and so on, and even almost becomes a religious sacrament, which is a type of unity, and so on. So he exploits what's possible with a flea landing into the scenario. Now, he doesn't just make that comparison once and leave it there. He extends it and develops it across the poem as he exploits various possibilities within that basic metaphor that he has set up. And that's making it an extended metaphor. So this is part of then, just to have a look at my overheads there. We have a poetry of situation, of seduction. I've mentioned the dramatic situation that Donne sets up and the extended metaphor. Now, the old term we used to have for this was a metaphysical conceit. Donne was described by later writers as a metaphysical poet and part of a school of metaphysical poetry, meaning they put forward very intellectual arguments in their poetry, very kind of rational, and drew a lot on science at the time, alchemy and medieval theology and philosophy and so on, right? So his intelligence is being used in amusing ways with this metaphysical conceit. Now, conceit's an old word. It comes from Italian concetto, which means concept. So we would talk about his concept for the poem. It is the extended metaphor. The flea biting both partners and coming together is the concept behind the poem. And we describe that as its metaphysical conceit in an older kind of language. Nowadays, slightly more modern way of talking about it, we would describe it as an extended metaphor. Then come to our final point on Donne. He might be guilty of rhetorical casuistry, if I have said that correctly. It's not a word you use every day, casuistry. Now, I've got a definition of that. It means having fun with arguments that are clever but rather unsound. You know, it probably wouldn't carry much force in a field of law or a courtroom, but they sound amusing and tickle our fancy and amuse us somehow. And Donne knows he's doing that deliberately, right? So we see the amusing use of intelligence, the amusing use of rhetorical skills, artfully used, but not exactly sound, rational arguments, so to speak. So generally, casuistry means unsound reasoning, but especially in relation to moral questions. And we could see how virginity or seduction were moral questions for the audience that Donne had in mind. So the poem is an example of what we might call witty sophistry as well. Another way to describe it, it has an inventive exuberance about it, as the poet is pseudo-logical and trying to have fun with his poem, this poem of seduction. So it's rhetorically very resourceful, we could say, and it sort of displays its cleverness. So then we might sum up by saying the poet is very entertaining company, while he's not exactly going to persuade a Plato or Aristotle in any sort of realistic, philosophical or logical or legal sense. And he entertains us with his witty intelligence put to a very playful purpose. So I want to touch off then my notion of poetry as transformative and so on. So how is this poem transformative, fitting in with our larger argument for today? Well, we see the creation and perceptions of another person, meaning the poet or the voice that he has created in this poem. Now here we're primarily dazzled or entertained, and we're amused by the witty intelligence of the poet, playful and all as that is. At the same time, we might also learn that men might go to extraordinary lengths to seduce a lady. That might well be a fact. That's on display in the poem, and it might be girls beware or be careful, or lads, there might be a few lessons here if that's what you're interested in. But ultimately I would argue that the poem expands our cultural consciousness and shows us another possibility. And the poem has been hugely popular and enjoyed for centuries now, 5 centuries. So the world of human possibility has been enriched and enhanced by what this poet has created here, and has become a transformative force in our poetic tradition, but in our culture as well. Now, this type of poem has been much admired, and that will lead nicely on to our second poem today, which is Caroline Duffy's Valentine, which I'm going to argue is actually a modern day version of the same poem. So A couple of things just about Caroline before we begin. She's from Glasgow, Scotland, was the poet laureate, first woman in a 4th century tradition of being laureate, which meant official poet to the royal family. She did that for 10 years and did a very inventive and modern updating of that job, which you can find out more about it later. Now, my main argument is she gives us a very brilliant extended metaphor in this poem. So she's inspired by Donne. That's going to be my argument. This poem was first published in her collection Meantime in 1993, and I'm going to argue I've read a good bit of Caroline, and what I really do admire about her is that she's an astute reader of the poetic tradition. She has gone back and read a lot of the classic and great poets, and actually has inspired her, and she has brilliantly transformed what they have given her into a modern contemporary version that sounds entirely plausible and works in our modern cultural context. So there's a deep line of connection between this poem and the last one, and that's why I've actually joined the two together for our audience here today and for our Leaving Cert students. So this poem is an extended metaphor, and her metaphor is going to centre on an onion. And this is a poem of seduction as well. And if you thought a flea was ingenious, that's just what Caroline Duffy does with an onion, the ordinary everyday onion. Again, unexpected comparison, but she does brilliant things with this. So we'll read it first, and then we'll have a quick look at it and talk about this poem then if we can. So here's Valentine by Caroline Duffy. So lads, if you're stuck for a good present for Valentine's Day, instead of a box of chocolates and roses, Raymond, down to Aldi and buy yourself a single onion. It'll probably set you back about 99 pence or cents, so not too expensive. But here we go, Valentine by Caroline Duffy. Not a red rose or a satin heart, I give you an onion. It is a moon wrapped in brown paper. It promises light like the careful undressing of love. Here, it will blind you with tears like a lover. It will make your reflection a wobbling photo of grief. I'm trying to be truthful. It's not a cute card or a kissogram. I give you an onion. Its fierce kiss will stay on your lips, possessive and faithful as we are, for as long as we are. Take it. Its platinum loops shrink to a wedding ring, if you like. Lethal. Its scent will cling to your fingers, cling to your knife. Okay, a very dark tone there coming out at the end. Watch out for a chap that's offering you an onion instead of a Valentine, we could argue. So we'll talk a bit about the poem generally, we'll look at some of its details, and then we'll stand back and say a few things about it. And the first thing we'll notice looking at the poem compared to the Donne poem, which is very regular in its 3 stanzas of 9 lines with a set rhyming scheme, is this poem is somewhat irregular. I'm going to argue that it's key once we understand another form that Caroline is dealing with here in the poem, but we'll come back to that question. We just observe it for the moment. What I will say is what holds together the poem as a poem holds it together as a certain element of repetition. So that not a red rose or a satin heart, but halfway through the poem we get not a cute card or a kissogram. Right, so that repetition is starting to tie the voice of the poem together. Twice the speaker says, I give you an onion, there in the second full quatrain, and then down near the end, the second last one, I give you an onion. And we get 2 instructions. The person speaking says here, and then it's mirrored later on the poem by take it, right? So there are certain patterns of similarity running across the poem that help unify it, as well as the it will, right? Its platinum loops, its scent. So all those lines that are beginning roughly similar give a certain unity, a formal unity to the poem, but not the very traditional one of a set stanza with a certain amount of lines and rhyming schemes. She's invented one of her own that actually holds the poem together. That makes sense. So we'll come back to why she does that in a minute. Now, I want to argue the poem's an extended metaphor. Again, she doesn't just make that comparison once. She does it early on in the poem, and then she develops it across the poem. Now, there's certain ingenuity in the speaker in this poem, as they find about 4 dimensions of an onion that can apply to a love situation. And all of them feel very fresh. All of them are very dynamic and quite surprising. And we delight in the intelligence of the speaker who we discover this with. So I won't give you a red rose or a satin heart. In fact, I'll give you an onion. So I'm not going to give you any of the cliched elements of romance this Valentine's. Now, what also Caroline Duffy doing is she's refreshing the poetry of love in some sense as well. Cliched images are roses, red hearts, Cadbury's chocolates. They're all the cliches. We don't want to hear that in poetry. We want to hear something fresh. So she gives us an onion, which we never expected. Let's see what she's going to do with that. So I give you an onion, the speaker says. Now, here's our first comparison then. It is a moon wrapped in brown paper. It promises light, like the careful undressing of love. So we get that. So the brown paper, the onion, is its brown skin. You have to unwrap it like a present then, and it's like a moon. Now, you'll expect to see a moon in love poetry, Professor Hanley, right? Under the Moon of Love. She's old enough to remember that song by Shawani Wadi in the 70s. So was Anne Cuddy. But anyway, the moon is associated with love, but she's refreshed that image by connecting it with an onion. And we didn't expect that comparison. And due to its shape and colour, we can see how the onion looks like a moon and is a suitable image or symbol of romance. We have that there. It promises life. And then she says you have to undress an onion. And in a romantic situation, there might be a little bit of undressing involved, slow and careful. So that's her comparison there. And she's ingeniously got that out of her onion there so far. Now here, take that onion. Now we go in another more serious direction that all the adults in the room will be all too familiar with, whatever about some of the youngsters. Here's your onion. It will blind you with tears like a lover. We all know there'll be a bit of torment in the romantic field. Sorry, Raven, but that's how it is, right? If you give your heart away, there'll be a bit of heartbreak involved at some point, unfortunately. Okay, so it'll break your heart. We all know because of acid in the onion, we start to cry. When we encounter onions, it produces tears. And so our speaker is saying this captures another important part of the experience of romance. You can't escape it, really, unfortunate as it is. Now, we get a simile here in the second quatrain. It's not a quatrain with 5 lines there, but it's like a lover. So that's a simile, a type of comparison, figure of speech. Right? Figures of speech are not literally true, but they help us to understand something. So it's like a lover. Then she says, or the speaker says, it will make your reflection a wobbling photo of grief. Now, we have another comparison here, but without using like or as. So like or as is your simile. Here we're told the onion will make your reflection a wobbling photo of grief. So the comparison with a mirror and photo coming in here. And because there's no like or as, but a comparison's been brought in, we have a type of local metaphor, I would argue here. It's different than the extended metaphor that's unfolding across the poem. She's giving you a very local metaphor here. The onion will produce tears. You'll start to cry, just in the same way that when you look in a mirror and the out heartbreak, you know, you're broken, and before you go downstairs to face the family, you want to wipe off the tears in the mirror, and you're like a shaking photo of yourself of grief. The onion can produce that effect like one might in the romantic scenario where that goes wrong. Speaker comes in, that all might sound terribly harsh and rough. I'm just trying to be truthful, says the voice here. I'm just giving you an honest account of the experience. That's how it is. Not a cute card or a kissogram. I'm giving you the real deal here, a complete picture of what it's like here. It's the best romantic present you've ever got, the onion, because it reveals so much about the nature of love. So I give you an onion. And its fierce kiss, now striking adjective, its fierce kiss, very strong and original, yet simple. And I admire that about Caroline with her everyday diction here that we're so used to. She's using the language of the everyday and she's lifting it a little with that striking adjective. It'll stay on your lips. So now we know onions have a very strong flavour. You know, an hour or two after, it's recommended a bit of a toothbrush if you're going to be kissing anybody after having a bit of onion in the dinner there. So a bit of toothpaste and a toothbrush, because onions have a strong flavour and its fierce kiss will stay on your lips. So, you know, that's very romantic, just about Karen Mills. I like that. I'd love to meet this speaker. She thinks till the next bit is revealed. Possessive and faithful as we are, for as long as we are. Now, I actually think a threat comes in here from the voice. It's kind of veiled. Up until now, we might say the comparison is unusual and the speaker's a bit odd, but interesting. I would kind of go with them. But I think a threat of possessiveness and control comes into the voice here. Possessive and faithful as we are. Now, it depends how you read that line, but for as long as we are. Don't you dare stray away or you'll see another side of me or of this situation. That's the first time this aspect of the speaker has been revealed. I'll come back to this in a minute when I reveal the second type of poem I believe Carol Ann is writing here. She's not just writing an extended metaphor, she's brought in something else. But here, take it, the speaker says. It's platinum loops. Now, so onion has very strong flavour, not easy forgotten or lost, a bit like my kiss when it's on your lips, but to remind you that I own you, you're mine, seems to be what the voice is saying there. Take it. Now the platinum loops, you cut an onion, you know it has loops inside it. Platinum, rich, precious metal, but it'll shrink to a wedding ring. Now a shrinking wedding ring on your finger could sound painful, sore, says many a person an appropriate image of marriage, right? And a certain shrinking of possibilities, a certain suffering, but also I own you and possess you, and you feel me on your finger and don't forget. Could be the element there. If you like. Now the tone of that, if you like, that voice has been captured. That's vaguely threatening, lethal. And now we head into the final strait, the last two lines. Its scent will cling to your fingers, cling to your knife. Now it's definitely more threatening there. That smell won't go away. There's a knife in the room. There's a knife in the room. And remember Chekhov's famous instruction in drama: if you introduce a gun in the first stanza or the first act of the play, make sure it's gone off by the third, you know? So if you bring in a prop like that, a hint that it's going to be used or make it be used in some ways. I think this knife has done more than chop an onion, or could potentially do so. So we've more than a veiled threat of violence there at the end of the poem. So something deep and significant has been revealed about the speaker. Now, to understand that, I believe Carol Ann has brilliantly combined another type of poem with our extended metaphor, inspired John Donne. And the roots actually of what she's done lies in what Donne has actually done. But she gives us an example of what we call the dramatic monologue. I would read this poem as not just an extended metaphor, it's also a dramatic monologue. Now, the dramatic monologue developed in the course of English literature. One of its places of origin is actually in Shakespeare's soliloquies. Do you remember the speeches on stage where Hamlet's speaking alone and he's revealing his inner thoughts? Or Othello's on stage and we get to know about his devious plans because he's just speaking them out to the audience. So the psychological interiority of a character is revealed in the soliloquy. And that's important to the dramatic monologue, particularly if it's picked up and developed by the great Victorian poet Robert Browning. But because we looked at John Donne's The Flea, there are characteristic elements or characteristics of that poem that can lend itself to development in the future in the dramatic monologue. We had a character speaking in a dramatic situation. And we had a strong voice trying to persuade somebody or say something to someone. Get to the end, and we see that characteristic is there with Carol Ann's poem, right? Now, Robert Browning is our great Victorian poet who develops the dramatic monologue, right? Famous poems like My Last Duchess. Now, often the dramatic monologue reveals a dark underbelly to the thinking of the speaking character that they're not consciously aware of, but has been revealed underneath the poem. And that's the characteristic we might see in Valentine. The speaker reveals their possessiveness, but don't realize probably that they have, but we pick up on it as a reader, and we realize there's a darker element to this poem than the speaker is realizing is there. Does that kind of make sense? And that's the dramatic monologue, and Carol Ann has brilliantly captured that. So for a dramatic monologue, we need a speaking voice. And now let's go back to the way she structured her poem. She's writing in modern times, so she can get away from rhymes and she can get away from the solid, consistent stanzas that we saw in Donne. She wants a more authentic speaking voice. And that will drive her formal choices in this poem. Not a red rose or a satin heart. It's something that somebody might just say. It doesn't sound too formal. I give you an onion. We can hear that person speaking. And then they develop that. And then they hear. And then take it. Or being a little pushy is a person speaking. Do you get the idea? So we hear a consistent voice speaking across that poem, as it were, and that's characteristic of the dramatic monologue, right? Also characteristic is there's a drama going on. Now here again, it's a drama of seduction, we have a dramatic situation. The speaker of the poem, we don't know whether it's a man or a woman, wants to entice somebody into a relationship with them. So there's somebody listening and they're being addressed, and the onion's been used as a proper tool to give expression to it. So the silent listener outside the poem is being addressed by the poem, if you like, right? Now, characteristic feature of dramatic monologue, can we trust the reader? Can we trust the speaker? Right? And I think what's apparent by the end of this poem is I wouldn't trust this lad with me door. I wouldn't trust him with myself if it's a lad, right? Because we're hearing a veiled note of threat there by the end. And characteristic of dramatic monologue is we're given a psychological insight into the mind of the speaker or the character. And often this all happens in one single vivid scene. And this is the moment that we have here, the moment of seduction when the onion has been handed over. So all these elements of the dramatic monologue are in place. We have a subtle characterization revealed through the speaker, and there's a relatively complex dramatic situation here with a couple of layers to it, no pun intended, with the onion as your central metaphor. Is that kind of making sense? So Caroline has carried out a brilliant synthesis of these two major forms. She's given you an extended metaphor, which is a tough enough feat in itself, express an idea about love across 4 different verses in the poem, each revelation being different. But then layered onto that, she gives you a dramatic monologue, a voice that's speaking and delivering the idea in the poem, so to speak. So when a poem is formally irregular, it is held together by these repeated phrases. But the great thing is it sounds like what a person might say if they're speaking naturally. Does that kind of make sense? You might repeat yourself in a certain situation, especially if you're intent on something and you're trying to get someone to do what you want them to do or persuade them in some way. So she has done that. And so the form then that this poem discovers for itself emerges out of the speaking voice and the dramatic situation that the poem imagines. And the form matches its subject matter and its speaker. So we're going to compare a little bit idiosyncratic. It actually is in keeping with the dramatic situation and the voice of a person speaking within that situation as the poem imagines it. So that's Valentine by Carroll and Duffy. Let's move on to, now those 2 poems are deeply linked. Our next 2 poems are different. Actually, I probably should say something about Caroline's poem, how that leads us into thinking about transformation. Okay. Well, in this poem, we could argue, meaning Valentine now, we haven't got to Ozymandias just yet. We hear the strangeness of another mind, right? Somebody who thinks differently than us or most of us. We encounter a sort of darker frame of thinking, and we encounter that. And somehow, once we've got that, we realize that could be part of the field of romance and might be best avoided or dodged. So she has given us a type of safe cognitive environment in her poem to encounter a voice like this and contemplate this possibility in the range of human possibilities in the romantic field. Now, her artfulness comes into play as she convinces us with a very real voice about this dramatic situation that prepares us and sharpens our perceptions, perhaps for the future. And in some sense, we are altered by that encounter. We understand something and grasp it, and we are transformed potentially, let's say. But let's have a look at Ozymandias by the great Percy B. Shelley. Now, we're on a century or 2 after John Donne. We're in the 19th century here, what we call romantic poetry. I could spend a long time talking to you about what makes this a romantic poem, and but we won't do loads of that. We'll have a read of the poem first. A little bit of background information, just to know that Ozymandias is the Greek name for Pharaoh Ramses II. So we're in Egypt. We're looking, is what Ramses II looked like according to the monumental sculptures of his time. If you go to the British Museum, they have a massive image of Pharaoh Ramses II. He was one of the great pharaohs, so this is Egypt at its height. Now, particularly nasty and brutal man as leaders had to be at that time and in the world. Now, Ozymandias is his name in Greek. That's how he was known to Greek culture. And he's around 1304, 1237 before our Common Era. Now, I'll come to the suggestions of Napoleon and George III, what that might mean for the poem in due course. But so we have a monument to a great Egyptian pharaoh, and it's been ruined by time. I'll just give you that much. We saw the image at the start of the lecture, at the beginning of the poem. Let's see what attitude towards this Shelley conveys and what comes across here and what we make of that. This poem is a sonnet, 14 lines, quite a radical sonnet, keeping with Shelley's rebelliousness, the sort of man that wouldn't do what other people told him to do, Professor Hadley, you know, and kind of found his own stubborn way of doing things. All right, so Ozymandias. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed." And on the pedestal these words appear: "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." A much loved poem, been studied by Irish students for years and others around the world. Well, let's put a poem in its contemporary context. But we could say the poem is an argument about time. It's an argument that great empires fade in time. The monuments of a great civilization fall apart and collapse in the long run of time. It's worth bearing in mind. So it's a comment about contemporary tyranny and how in the long run time will judge it and lay it in ruin. That's the larger argument you could make about the poem. So why does Shelley pick up on this theme? Why does he write this poem? He has a great sense of urgency in his time that this message needs to be delivered. Now, unfortunately, it's an always relevant message. But why in his time? Because Napoleon had gotten his big white horse and was charging across Europe, robbing countries and defeating armies everywhere, trying to build a modern empire inspired by the greats of the past. And he had taken Egypt in 1798. Within the 20-year period the poem has been written. So that's one aspect of the poem. Egypt was, once its riches were discovered, it became very popular to the Western mind. And that's set up in the beginning of the poem. I met a traveller from an antique land for a couple of centuries there, before the world shrunk and before the internet and telephones and computers. People like to hear about exotic places and travels far away. So there was an intense fascination with that travel literature, and somebody giving you an account of a faraway and exotic place. So the poem is playing into that culture of exotic travel at one level. And then the message that comes back is this image of the destruction of the tyrant. Now, it wasn't just Napoleon potentially that Shelley had in mind for this poem. There are a number of possibilities, and I'll talk about the value of that in due course. He was no fan of George III of England either, an old, despised and dying king, as he famously called him in another sonnet, England in 1819, which is so radical and dangerous a poem he didn't publish it in its lifetime. It only came out after his death. Now, there's a good reason for that, because George III, in the Romantic period, as we call it, the French Revolution had happened. This suggested the possibility that the monarchy in England could be attacked as well, right? So England goes into one of its very reactionary phases. It's normally a very liberal country, but the threat of revolution abroad brought up the spectre of revolution and rebellion at home. Now, George III is a very unpopular king amongst liberals, but he had introduced a proclamation against seditious writings and publications in 1792. So we'll say that again, a proclamation against seditious writings and publications. Now, seditious writing is any writing that might threaten to undermine the state, or any writing that might threaten to undermine the monarchy and bring down the government. right? It's the act of sedition. So writers are under intense pressure then. Be very careful about what they wrote, because they could be dragged out the streets and have their head chopped off or be hung from a pole somewhere. So writers in that situation often turns to allegory or indirect ways of expressing the situation. So to pick an ancient figure from Egypt years ago who was destroyed by time might be a safe way of talking about contemporary issues and a way of distancing yourself from them. But you're really talking about contemporary issues, and people are smart enough to make the connection. But if you were hauled into court to say, I didn't do that, sure, it's a poem about a dead Egyptian pharaoh, dead long ago. You get the idea, you have some sort of protection. So you have something like that going on in the poem. So, I mentioned it was a sonnet, which is a poem of 14 lines, so we might consider some of its formal aspects then here. In the classic sonnet, what we call a Petrarchan sonnet, you have an octave and a sestet. That's 8 lines and 6 lines. Now, there's something of that going on in this poem. If we take the turn into the sestet there, line number 9, and on the pedestal these words appear. So that's the volta of the poem, as it was called, its turning point, right? As it's heading towards the end. Now, classic Petrarchan sonnet has an A-B-B-A rhyme scheme, and you have 2 quatrains joined together by the rhyming scheme. If you look at Shelley's poem here, the rhyming scheme is the first place I would look at to try and see what type of sonnet it was. And his rhyming scheme is very radical and unusual, and you have to go, okay, what's going on here? Why has he done this? And what's happening? So he's giving you A, B, A, B. Could suggest a Shakespearean sonnet, by the way, which is the other major form in English. English poets struggle to write Petrarchan sonnets because they're very difficult to write in English, which is a rhyme-weak language, believe it or not. I won't go into explaining that now. It just lacks rhymes, believe it or not, while Italian, which is the home of the sonnet, is rich in rhymes, right? So Petrarchan sonnet, you can write a good sonnet with a limited amount of rhymes and be very dazzling in Italian. Very difficult to do in English, right? So the English had to adopt the sonnet slightly, and they just changed it around a little bit. The Italians wouldn't be terribly happy, but they changed it a little just to nudge in an extra rhyme or 2. And so the classic Shakespearean sonnet, so-called, or English sonnet, goes by quatrain, 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 couplet setup, right? Now, your classic Petrarchan is A, B, B, A, B, B, A, something like C, D, E, C, D, E, and you end on E, right? Your Shakespearean sonnet will be A, B, B, A, C, D, D, C, E, F, F, E, and G, G, and you've gone from E into F into G. You see that there at the end? You've got yourself in 2 extra rhymes there just to get you out of a tight corner, but you've shifted something of the structure of the sonnet. Now, we look at this sonnet, it doesn't do either of those things, but I still think it's leaning towards the Petrarchan model with a significant innovation in the rhyming scheme, and we'll detect why Shelley did that in a minute. So he's got a land and sand, stone and frown, the half rhyme with the stone and frown, that's giving you A, B, A, B. So good. Then he shifts. Well, continues with land and frown. That's an A, but he changes with read. He gives you a C there. D then with things, and he gives us back a C with fed. So command, read, things, fed. It's very unusual little quatrain. A, C, D, C. Right? Now we've ended our 2 quatrains, and we're turning with the volta and into the sestet, the last 6 lines. And he does something that you might expect here. He gives you E, D, E. That's appear and despair, or linked half rhymes. Kings is D. And he's giving you F, decay, and away, or F and E, bear, brings us back to despair, and appear with the E there. So the oddball rhyme there is that D, and the way he brings in that D early on, and I'm going to quickly horse into this. I normally leave it to you guys to figure this out by having a close look at them, but he has actually linked things and kings by that means. And he's linked kings back to that phrase in parentheses, these lifeless things. So kings become these lifeless things, and through rhyme he has directly linked that idea there. Do you get the idea there in a way? And he breaks out of any sort of formal convention of the sonnet in a way to try and achieve that. Now, I mentioned that Shelley's a bit of a rebel. He likes to break out and do things differently and won't be told what to do. So even with his sonnet, he'll break the rules, but he'll have a very good reason for doing that, which is that connection of these lifeless things with kings there and so on, right? So I met a traveller from an antique land, and he told me this story about seeing 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone standing in the desert. So we see the two legs standing in the desert, broken off, and then near on the sand, half sunk, we see a shattered visage, French word for face, visage lies. So the face is broken off, the head is broken off the monument, and it has a frown on it, and a wrinkled lip, and a sneer, a cold command. Not a pleasant guy to be. Even at his face and his monument, he looks like a tyrant. It's a nice list of three there: frown, a wrinkled lip, and a sneer of cold command. Sneer, such a strong word, right? So condescending image on this guy's face. And they tell us, and this is the interesting setup that he gives here, that the sculptor read this face well. Now we take the sculptor as the figure of the artist. Artists are perceptive people, right? They see deep into the life of things, and they can see things about the tyrant that the tyrant can't see about themselves. So they tell us that the sculptor well knows passions read which yet survive. So he captured the deep negative emotions, the authoritarianism of this figure, and he expressed it in his face. And the artist read that face well. A bit like Shelley reading George III or Napoleon, if you like. We understand. And the passions survive, although they're stamped on these lifeless things, the ruined monument. The hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. Now, that's a very big statement there. The artist has essentially mocked the man that commissioned them to create this piece, but your man was so dumb he didn't even realize it. But the artist captured him and really created a mirror to mirror back to this guy what he was like, but he didn't actually realize it. And the artist, unlike the tyrant, has a heart. And his heart inspires him, and he created this work of art, negative as it was, but he has communicated to eternity what this Ramses guy was like. And the romantic poet likes to have his heart fed, right, and to be nourished as an artist, and he is a person of feeling and responsibility. So we're seeing romanticism coming out there. And on the pedestal, these words are written, and they become ironic in the poem. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look at my works, ye mighty in despair. Now, one of his monuments is all that's left, and it's broken and it's ruined. So time has made a fool of him and his message. That kind of makes sense. And nothing beside remains. The whole civilization he built up, the tyrant and his mighty empire all around him has faded in time. Nothing of it remains. Around the decay of that colossal wreck, everything is boundless, without boundary. So there's no barriers, nothing to be seen, only sand. Bare, and we have the lone and level sands stretching far away. And that's an image of time, it's an image of decay, it's an image of emptiness, right? So the landscape expresses a political notion or idea. Time wipes out empires in due course. So Ozymandias wasn't so mighty in the end, right? So we've empty space, and that's the future that emerged from that violent past, right? So pay heed, tyrants, right? Might be the message of this poem. So the monument testifies against Ramses in an ironic way with this subtext of a message that works against him. The artist captured the tyrant you were, and you didn't see it in your lifetime. You commissioned and paid him, but then in time, your monument was ruined, and that's all that's left of it, is this broken visage, right? So, and you don't sound like a pleasant guy. That's the message for eternity. Wouldn't want to know you, right? Not the sort of man you'd meet every day, and you wouldn't want to meet him, as it were. Now look at the word clusters. Apart from his rhyming scheme, there's a lot of internal music going on in this poem. So we've land, stand, sand, command, and then we hear Ozymandias. It's there in the title of the poem, and we hear sands again. So we've this internal music going on. And look at the lone and level, the strong alliteration, sands, stretch, the alliteration there, and boundless and bare in the second last line of the poem. So this poem is complex, as I want to argue, and has 4 different levels of complexity, I would want to say, that the poet has managed to hold together across his 14 lines. First off, it articulates an idea. It tells you something about tyranny, and it tells you something about time. It wants you to understand some idea about this, which is the poem's argument, we could say. Then he brings us to a setting. He brings us to an exotic place, and we get enough details there to know where we are. We're in the desert. We've seen a sphinx-like type creature. We are in Egypt, and we can see where we are. Then he has managed to generate a tone of voice with words like sneer and wrinkled lip. I don't think the voice of the poet in the poem is that fond of Ramses, and we hear that tone and we know where he stands on the issue indirectly through the tone of voice that's generated in the poem, and we encountered it. And then our fourth element of complexity is the poem has generated a kind of music, right? That's the alliteration, the assonance, the consonants, the rhyming scheme. And he's done all of this within 14 lines. So here's my final argument on its formal aspect. I would argue the poem is loosely Petrarchan. We have our octave and our sestet. And Milton had argued, the great English poet Milton, no better man, that the Italians had a weakness in their sonnet as far as he saw it. He thought the weakness of the Italian sonnet is the two quatrains making up the octave weren't connected enough. And he strove to unify those two quatrains and pull them together. And that's the Miltonic sonnet in English. Right? As a Petrarchan character, but overcoming what he saw as a weakness in the Italian poem of having two quatrains but unifying them. Arguably, the two quatrains are, it's the first 8 lines of the poem, the 4 and 4 are deeply unified, as line 4 ends with a shattered visage lies whose frown and we spill over, and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command builds on from what had gone on in the first quatrain, and he continues across the 8 lines there with a loose Petrarchan rhyming scheme going on, as I identified earlier. Does that kind of make sense? And we get 2 strong tercets, which are a feature of the Italian sonnet or the Petrarchan sonnet, and that's the lines of 3. There definitely is a logical break after we get the quote from the pedestal of the statue. Look at my works, ye mighty in despair! Exclamation mark. We end there, and we have an EDE rhyming scheme suggesting a tercet, a 3-line verse structure within the sestet, 6 lines with a 3-3 division, and nothing beside remains is a new thought within the tercets. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, and the tercet ends off there, we have a second distinct tercet going on there within the sestet. Is that kind of making sense? So quite a Petrarchan structure and an almost Miltonically Petrarchan poem, if we look at the octave as deeply unified, we could argue, right? So that's no mean feat, that's complex to carry out there. And Shelley only wrote about 18 sonnets compared to the over 200 that his friend, well, not his friend, Wordsworth wrote. Wordsworth wrote a lot of great sonnets. To write 200, you'd expect lots of really good ones, but he wrote some bad ones as well. Shelley never wrote a bad sonnet, but he only wrote 18, and he never repeated himself. Every single one of them is distinctive, so that's fair going. So he didn't just do it this once, if you know what I mean. He did it over 18 poems. That's just as a matter of general interest. Okay, we'll have a look then quickly at our last poem of the day. Well, sorry, I want to make some argument about what we learn from the Shelley poem in terms of transformation. We'll do that just since I'm at the computer. I'll move on to our next poem there. But poems invite us in to look at the world and to study the world and know something about the world. But they don't give away what they understand too easily, because they invite you in and they want you to figure it out. So they're not going to tell you directly. Part of the pleasure of poetry is you're working out the understanding that you think the poet wants to give to you, right? That's the pleasure of poetry and the enjoyment of it and so on. So this poem doesn't state its meaning directly, but it invites you as a reader into the intellectual space that it has created in its 14 lines, and invites you to contemplate and to think and to join up the connections, as it were. Now, he doesn't want you to think if the poem is about absolutely anything. Right? He has a range of possibilities, but it can't be about everything. It could be about a dead Egyptian king. That's the first level of meaning. But it could also be a potential reference to Napoleon. It has potentially the possibility of also being about George III. If we take it that all 3 of those figures are tyrants and are politically domineering, because that's what the poem's considering as it's concerned. Does that kind of make sense? So a number of possibilities, but it's not about shopping. You know what I mean? It's not about going to China on your holidays, right? It's some meditation on tyranny, but there are a couple of possibilities in it. So it's a generative field of possibilities within a limited range now, let it be said. But it invites you in and asks you to complete the poem. And now, as we can take it, tyranny doesn't go away. It's always relevant, unfortunately. Right? But the poet has left the poem open enough that it can still resonate today for us. Does that kind of make sense? right? And at the same time, it is about something. It's committed enough to its vision, okay? And we are transformed as we enter this poem and realize that it can be applied to our contemporary situation, much as it grew from history itself. So the poem is eternally relevant, sadly, this one. You know, as long as there are tyrants around. And I won't name any that might be around today, but there might be a few. So, quick talk through there. We're getting tight for time. We'll have a look at our contemporary Irish poet here. This is Meehan. She visited the college a couple of years ago, by the way. That's a picture of my slides. She's in visual next door with our students that won in the literary awards that year. It was right before lockdown happened. That's Meehan in the middle of the mall with her little yellow scarf. So she visited us here in the college a couple of years ago and presented our literary awards. Let's have a look at this poem. It's a beautiful poem of hers. I really like it. And it's My Father Perceived as a Vision of St. Francis, for Brendan Kennelly. It was the piebald horse in next door's garden frightened me out of a dream with her Donne whinny. I was back in the box room of the house, my brother's room now, full of ties and sweaters and secrets. Bottles chinked on the doorstep. The first bus pulled up to the stop. The rest of the house slept, except for my father. I heard him rake the ash from the grate, plug in the kettle, hum a snatch of a tune. Then he unlocked the back door and stepped out into the garden. Autumn was nearly done. The first frost whitened the slates of the estate. He was older than I had reckoned, his hair completely silver, and for the first time I saw the stoop of his shoulder, saw that his leg was stiff. What's he at? So early, and still stars in the west. They came then, birds of every size, shape, colour. They came from the hedges and shrubs, from eaves and garden sheds, from the industrial estate, outlying fields. From Dubber Cross they came, and the ditches of the North Road. The garden was a pandemonium when my father threw up his hands and tossed the crumbs to the air. The sun cleared O'Reilly's chimney, and he was suddenly radiant, a perfect vision of St. Francis, made whole, made young again in a fingless garden. Okay, it's definitely our biggest transformation in the poem, as our older, elderly father is transformed into a more youthful vision of St. Francis, lover of animals, lover of the birds, in a Finglas garden of all places there in the north side of Dublin. God bless the people of Finglas. Okay, hope a few of them are listening. But anyway, okay, well, that poem tells us a story. It's fairly narrative-like. I'll talk through some of its elements quickly. I would say in the first stanza, longish stanza there, she gives us a setting for the poem. We know it's morning time. She's in the box room of the family house, the old small bedrooms of council terrace houses back in the day. It's turned into her brother's room now. It's early in the morning, back in the day. It's written in the early 90s. Milkmen came along and delivered milk to your door in milk bottles. So we know where we are, what time of the day it is. Second stanza, she's brought in except for my father there. And we'll look at how she does that in a minute. And we know the poem, and it's now about her father. The subject of the poem really emerges here, and she describes him going about his morning routine, raking out the ash from the grate, plugging in the kettle and the tune. And then he steps out into the garden, and we get a vision of the father before the transformation. So he goes out into the garden. It's autumn time, very old conceit here. It's the autumn time of his life. He's getting older, and here he is now. There's frost on the roofs of the estate, and his hair is gone grey and it's frosty on top. An interesting comparison there. Now we have this key verse in the poem. I want to argue that this is the transitional verse, verse 4. And the poem takes on a kind of verbal energy here at this point, and the poem starts to speed up with the repetition of from. We'll talk about that in a minute. And we have a transition. And that lifts us up. It's almost like this poem has been running down the motorway, the airfield, and then it has a moment of lift off as we ascend into the vision of St. Francis that emerges at the end, and we have the transformation. The father throws up the crumbs to the birds, and the birds come into him, and we have a vision of Francis in the garden there, okay? But we've built up to that with that key transitional verse there, right? So the story has a beginning, a middle, and the end, and by the end of it, something has changed. Something isn't as it was before the poem began. The old man is transformed into this vision of St. Francis. So a couple of things of interest in the poem. Beautiful internal music she generates. Third line there, we've the dawn whinny of the piebald horse. Dawn whinny. Look at those broad vowels. We can hear the whinny of the horse. Very onomatopoeic as the horse sound comes out there. Then we have the bottles chinked on the doorstep. Third line from the end in the first stanza, that chinked, another onomatopoeic word. And look at her list of three. I really love the way she's done this. She's talking about the brother's room. He's taken over her bedroom in the box room, and it's now full of ties and sweaters and secrets. Now, the brilliant one is that third one. The other two are concrete objects, ties, sweaters. We don't expect the third one. It's a surprise. Secrets, a boy's secrets, a teenage boy's secrets, you know. It's different from me, a girl, and I'm an older woman, and I'll never understand his world. And that's very suggestive and gives a depth to the poem. And it's definitely different than the other two and works really, really well. Then we've doorstep, stop, slept. Now, there's the assonance and consonants to be found in those words. Look at her line break, guys. Point that out to my students. She ends the verse with slept, but there's no full stop there. We call that a run-on line. And we not only go across the next line, we go across to the next verse, and that makes the next word really emphatic, except for my father. And he's an exceptional man, and he stands out as we land on that. And now she has announced the true subject of the poem, but her formal decision to break across the verse there really emphasizes that and dramatizes it as we come into that there. We get lists of three in the poem. He does three things. He rake, great onomatopoeic word, rake, rake. He rakes the ash from the grate. He plugs in the kettle, and we hear he hums a snatch of a tune. List of three. So the human brain identifies patterns as three as a basic pattern. My psychologist, Dr. Friend, might agree with me there. And we have set up a pattern, and our brain likes that because we're pattern-seeking creatures. Okay, and so a pattern is set up there. With the first frost whiten the slates of the estate. And look at her double and jammed lines there in that stanza. She slows the poem down to its slowest point with two run-on lines where she starts to describe the stoop of his shoulder. The stoop is a run-on line as we go across to of his shoulder. She does that once, but then she does it again. Saw that. We pause there again and run-on line. His leg was stiff. So the man is stooping and stiff, and the poem has slowed down there to its slowest point as the man is elderly and old. And then she asks two rhetorical questions. What's he at so early and still stars in the west? Now, she slowed the poem right down to that point with the rhetorical questions, and we almost stop there. And then the poem starts to find a new energy. And we get this transitional verse. The birds come into the scene. Birds of every size, shape, colour. Look at that list of three. We heard it before, and now it's coming back transformed. They came from the hedges and shrubs, from eaves and garden sheds, from the industrial estate, outlying fields. From Dubber Cross they came, and the ditches of the North Road. And the poem has sped up again, and it's taken on energy, and it's prayer-like in its litany-like invocations. Right? A prayer, a transformation, those repetition of from and from and from is like a prayer, okay? And the list of three. And then she inverts the syntax. She puts the came at the end of the line. Normally you'd say they came from Dubber Cross. That's inverted syntax. Sounds unusual. You might hear it in an old-fashioned prayer. And it gives us that. And then we stop. And suddenly the garden was a pandemonium. And she gives us that lovely big pandemonium, 5-syllable word. It's the only massive word and only literary word we get in the poem. Well, Dubs might say it was pandemonium at the Curragh races when your man won, right? So the Dubs might say that, but it also comes from John Milton and Paradise Lost. He invented that word, and she reaches up for a literary word as she lists her dictionary, the ordinary and the everyday, as she's getting ready to give us the vision, right? So chaos, and she reaches up to Paradise Lost, no less. My father threw up his hands, tossed the crumbs to the air, the sun, and that's exactly how it breaks there. We have a pause, and we go across the verse again. It cleared O'Reilly's chimney. So we have a moment of revelation as the sun appears. And it's O'Reilly's chimney. Sure, I don't have to explain those O'Reillys. Sure, we all know. All of us in the area know those O'Reillys. We're very familiar. She's writing a poem about where people, he was suddenly radiant. Religious word. Look, the diction's elevated there. He's radiant. Now she gives us a beautiful medial sejra, guys. She pirouettes out this poem beautifully. A last little dance there. Made whole, made young again. And and we pause in that middle break there. The medial caesura is that comma. It's a beautiful little linguistic pirouette. And where does all this happen? The most unlikely of places, in a fingless garden. And we're transformed as we see the Father transformed there in Finglas of all places. God bless the people of Finglas, I say, right? And so the extraordinary can happen in the ordinary. And the everyday can be transformed and is transformed. And that'll be my final note there on transformation. We want this to happen. We go with her description of this old man and a very typical routine. We all understand that our own parents have done it maybe, and we love the way she gives us this world, and we understand her desire to see the Father changed and transformed into something, and we're happy to see that happen. So we see her vision of the world, her perception of things, and we share that with her throughout the poem, and we lift off with her at the end, as poetry is always about the unexpected, and we kind of didn't see that coming, and she lifts us up into that vision as she delivers it there, and we're going, yeah, Paula, well done, that's great, and we're with you there all the way. And once we've encountered that vision, we can't unsee it and not see it again. So that's transformation and poetry's capacity for transformation. So I think we'll finish that there, and we might have a question or two quickly. All right, thank you very much.